thank you for taking some time out of your day to talk to us about the climate change and just the crazy jungle out there involving earth changes, basically. Really appreciate your time today.
It is a jungle out there, that's for sure.
Absolutely.
Don't want to learn or anything. It's terrible.
It is terrible. We on our channel, I try very hard to have a non-biased approach. And it's just alarming to me, when I'm the habitual fence sitter watching people bicker and argue about facts that are so blatantly obvious about just natural cycles. It's shocking to me.
Well, it is, because mainly when you talk to them, they only want to go back 50 to 100 years.
Right.
That's all they want to talk about.
It's crazy. And there's so many pieces to the puzzle for the big picture, and we wanted to take a non-biased approach and just show people the science and the facts so they can make their own conclusions, to what's going on. To me, it's hard for me not to be biased now because I just feel like the data is it's staring you right in the face. You can't deny it once you look at things objectively. So on Grand Solar Minimum channel, we bring in different people. We've had John Casey on, we've had Valentina Zarkova, we've had other independent researchers on, so to have you on for your input is great. All the data it may be different, but it lines up to the same sort of time frame where society really is going to have to learn to adapt in the future.
That's certainly true, and we're already going in through changes into the next global cooling cycle. It just takes a little time to get into it, because we have never been in a cycle before where we've lived through a global warming cycle into a global cooling cycle. So we're just we don't have that much data, so we don't know how many years it takes, 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 years, but evidence is there that the climate is now changing towards the cooling.
You watched the State of the Union with President Trump the other night?
Part of it I did, yes.
There's a lot of, he's taken a lot of criticism because he actually mentioned all the storms, but he didn't blame man-made global warming. And I found it kind of, for me, I've always been a Weather Channel kind of guy just because some of their meteorologists I've always liked, but I found it a little odd that the Weather Channel did an article so quickly criticizing the president for not blaming man-made global warming, as if to pass this off.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, okay, I need to send you a graphic. I'm going to be doing a hurricane webinar on Tuesday, and I have a great graphic on there that I created on hurricanes, United States hurricane landfalls during the past 120 years. Landfalls and major hurricane landfalls.
Yeah, and to finish up on that point, it's what's going to be hard for me from now on is how to trust the integrity of that particular channel now, since they are clearly trying to push man-made global warming on everyone.
Oh, they are. The Weather Channel is very liberal on that.
Let's open it up here. Strongest cycle and 40 to... Oh, I got to plug my laptop in.
Correct.
Okay.
And what this shows is going back to about 1860. The blue line on top is tracking the hurricane landfalls for the United States, and the red line on the bottom is the major hurricanes. So what you see is between 1871 to about 1901, let's say 1880 or so, we had a big uptick in hurricane landfalls. Then about 70 years later, another big uptick. And now here we are 70 years later, and we're given another big uptick.
Oh, wow.
So this is natural cycles.
Right.
So what the Weather Channel, they don't do their own research. So they don't really have a clue what's going on. The National Hurricane Center doesn't have a clue what's going on either, because they don't really research cycles enough, especially natural cycles. So this is why I'm number one on I've been number one on the preseason hurricane predictions the past 10 years. Number one in the country.
You had a busy year last year, then.
I nailed it. I predicted the hurricane for Florida, the Gulf, and Texas. I nailed it.
Nice. Well, not nice. I mean, those were bad
hurricanes. This is all natural cycles. Tracking hurricanes through natural cycles.
Right. You knew what you were looking at.
I know what I'm looking at, and these other people that are putting out the garbage, they don't know what to look at.
Is it?
That's the problem.
I think a lot of it's just politically, motivated at this point. Like a lot of people, it's hard to find the integrity in the research, without the controversy these days.
Well, I think the Weather Channel has even fired a couple of meteorologists that were questioning man-made global warming.
Wow.
And there's a lot of things out there. I'm a member of the American Meteorological Society, which is the big group for meteorologists and climatologists, and it's like the AMA for doctors. And I wanted my corporation to be a member, and they rejected it because they went on my website and looked at my views on climate change, and they rejected. They would not let my company become a member of the AMS. And I talked to someone there, and I was only second or third time in the past 50 years that a company has been rejected. You better believe that's political.
Yeah, beyond political.
They are hook, line, and sinker on man-made global warming, just like the Weather Channel. All politically driven.
Have you been attacked in other ways when it comes to censorship or just
I've
sort
been
of blacklisted?
I had the University of Maine shut down one of my talks. A conservative that got shut down at Berkeley. Now some famous meteorologists, climatologists, such as Dr. William Gray, who passed away a year or so ago from the University of Colorado. He and another famous meteorologist got shut down right at their own university. They wanted to talk on climate change, and the university shut them down. This is common. We're not allowed to speak at universities.
And it looks like to me Berkeley is not helping themselves because they get labeled as being a liberal college, and when you see a conservative get shut down because he speaks about something that's not on a liberal agenda, that to me right there, Berkeley is digging their own hole. If they don't want that label, things like that shouldn't happen.
No, it shouldn't. And when I got shut down up in Maine, I was going to speak at a can't remember the name of the place now. It's an institute up there, but they're closely connected with the university. And when we set up when I accepted to speak there, I told them, well, I want you to realize I'm going to be speaking on natural cycles. And they said, that's okay. So they had it all set up, and they advertised it for a month. Then 3 days before my talk, I noticed that 3 people from the University of Maine were on my website. The next morning, I got a letter canceling my talk.
Wow.
And they blamed it on staffing problems at the institute. Well, I went on their website, and their website was trying to reschedule another talk for that same time period.
Unreal.
And then the news media got a hold of the institute, and the president actually admitted that they were strong-armed by the University of Maine.
Strong-armed by who?
The University of Maine has a climate division. They get a lot of grant money.
So it's the grant money that they're worried about
The
losing.
grant money.
Gotcha.
They want to shut down anything that talks about natural cycles because they want to preserve their grant. They want to keep going as is. They don't want any interference at all.
And David, I think you just answered my next question, which was, why do you think the real reason is why so many deny global cooling? And it's starting to sound like money has a lot of the reason to do with it.
Well, it's all money. It's driven through the grant system, for one thing, because the grant system is driven through big power money that's pushing green energy. That's the big source of it.
Yeah.
So that trickles down to the grant system. And the grant system, when they start putting out grants, it usually stays that way for 10, 15 years when they try to attack a problem. So the only grant money available for about a 15-year period was for man-made, to try to prove man-made global warming. You could not get a grant. I have talked to a couple retired heads of science departments at universities, and they said you could not get a grant to study natural cycles. And if they knew you were trying to study natural cycles or spoke up against man-made global warming, you would either lose grants or not be able to get grants.
Oh my goodness.
So it's all money. It's the grant system pushing everything. And I spoke to a representative, U.S. representative of Congress back in December, about the time Donald Trump was elected, and I told them that one thing they need to do is take a look at overhauling the grant system.
Yeah.
That's a big problem in the grant system. Just like everything you're hearing in the news now, where they're trying to bring out information about what's happened during the past 8 years on the FBI and CIA and all this stuff.
Bad news.
There's so much corruption.
Yep. Yeah, I just find it intriguing that there's so many people that deny global cooling on a daily basis. I actually follow a meteorologist from back where I'm from in southwest Ohio. And we had a little conversation, a friendly chat about it. And when I was trying to talk to him about the cycles and the grand solar minimum, he answered back to me and said, I just want to make I'll quote one person here, it's all fake news. And it just, I know better than that. And I can't believe that's their easy way out, that nobody is willing to even talk about. Like you said, no one's willing to talk about the cycles. And that's all we're trying to talk about. We're not trying to push fear, but this is about cycles, really.
The people in the science divisions at universities cannot speak about natural cycles. They're not allowed to. And the sad part of it is, and this is what I've been told, is that to get tenure in a science department, it's publish or perish. You have to do that for 10 years to get your tenure. To get your tenure, you have to publish what your boss tells you to publish. So these young scientists are only allowed to publish papers concerning man-made global warming, because this is what the heads are told to do, told them to do. So the young people are being trained, and then pushed to only publish certain type of material. And so that's why you get a flood of papers out there just on man-made global warming. But I've noticed during the past year there's been a lot more being published on natural cycles.
Yeah.
A lot more. It's starting to turn.
Slowly. And Mari and I, on our channel, we started a little bit of a series, Global Cooling Papers, where we're trying to, and there's no really easy way to read these unless you're well educated. And so we try to read out the conclusions first and then leave the link to the paper in the description box. And that Mari and I have noticed that as well. There's a lot more available this year than there was, say, last year when we started really getting into the research of the grand solar minimum. So yeah, there is definitely, the drumbeat's getting louder. We're seeing more scientists talk about global cooling and cycles and stuff like that.
Yes, but much more. A good website for you to check out, maybe you know about it, is called the No Tricks Zone.
Oh yeah, we were on that. It's great.
It's out of Germany. I've been on there. They published about 10 of my things on there, I think. They just put on my hurricane press release about 5 days ago. But there's a flood of papers on there now coming out. And a lot of the papers, of course, some are published in leading journals and some are not. Some just independent research, because most of the time we're not allowed to get published.
Yeah,
the American Meteorological Society will not publish stuff on natural cycles. They will not do it. I tried to do it, and they said, not in this journal.
Wow.
That's the fascinating part. We have this section on our channel to break some of these papers down, and the point I want to drive to our viewers on the channel is a lot of this research being done on various different topics. You have people researching aspects of the sun, You have people researching planetary alignments. There's all different aspects. All these different topics that people are researching sort of come down to the same timeline breakdown. Basically, within the next 2 to 3 decades, things are going to change so drastic. It's not going to be within people's, like in modern day society's comprehension to even be able to deal with it.
Well, that's very true. Even on the cold weather this year in the United States, it didn't happen in Europe, at least not the Great Britain to a little bit east of there. But they're cooling down. They're going to have a cold February. The Arctic right now, mid-Canada, has really cooled down. We've had a strange weather pattern because of the La Nina that was in place. And because of that, we had storms going up into Alaska, pulling warm air up into Alaska. And that's been eroding the ice up there, and they haven't froze up as much as they normally would. But the La Nina is starting to fade, and Alaska is really starting to cool down now. So they're going to have some ice restoration during late January and February into March. And it takes time to cool down the oceans after a global warming cycle.
Yep.
Oceans have a big lag time as compared to air temperatures. So it takes a number of years for things to really cool down. But we're seeing the cycle starting to change now because we have this cold air that the United States had this year. And there's an article in the paper a few weeks back, they're talking about a freak 250-year cycle, the cold. They called it a freak cycle. No, that's not a freak cycle. We had this all the time during the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. It was common. All this means is we now have some cold air available, and it's coming back.
Yes.
And people are getting shocked about how nasty the winter has been up north. Well, we're getting back to normal. That's all it is. Now, next year, as our weather system straighten out a little bit, we won't have a La Nina. We'll have a different weather pattern, and this will spread more to Europe also next year.
Yeah, we try to tell some of our viewers that this takes time, that this is not going to be an overnight thing, because a lot of folks will comment on some of your videos saying, well, it's hot down here in Texas, and that nobody's saying right now we're going into a complete global shutdown. It's going to be an ice age right now, but from what do you follow the temperature anomaly on drroyspencer.com?
I don't know if I do that one or not.
He keeps a track of the temperature anomaly in the troposphere, and since February of 2016, it was up plus 0.88 Celsius, and as of today, it's down to plus 0.26. So it's dropped 0.62 Celsius in just 2 years. And to me, I think as far as I know, he doesn't believe in man-made global warming either. He's more of a cycles type of person as well, that global warming is just natural. It has nothing to do with man-made emissions. So, but even people who don't want to jump on the ice age bandwagon or anything still shows the work that since 2016, indeed, we are cooling, and slowly but surely, 0.3 Celsius each year isn't a lot, but over time, if it continues in that trend, like you said, we're just going back to normal. People that were alive during the 78, 79 winters, those were the normals back then. They were always cold winters in the 50s and the 60s. So
that's what I've been telling people, and just get used to it. That's what I grew up with in the 50s and 60s and 70s. Get used to it. That's what you're going to have. No, we're not going to go to an ice age. The ice age is still 30,000 years away. But we're going to be gradually getting cooler and cooler on each global warming cycle that comes every 230 years or so. From now on, each global warming cycle is not going to be as warm as the one before it. And we know that. We're back in the 800 AD to about 1100 AD. It was much warmer than today. Much warmer. And they're trying to say that we've never been this warm before. No, you just go back 1,000 to 1,200 years ago, and it's a lot warmer than today. And we had 50% less ice up in the Arctic. than we did today. That's why they're uncovering so many artifacts over, you probably saw that in the news, just yesterday or the day before over, I don't know if it's Denmark or somewhere over through there in the mountains. A lot of artifacts from 1,000 years ago are being uncovered from ice melt. Well, that means there wasn't any ice there 1,100 years ago.
Right.
Artifacts had to get there, and they got covered up during the past 900 years of cold weather. Because we have a couple cycles. One comes about every 1,200 years where you really warm up greatly. Then the global warming cycles between that aren't quite as warm. Then you warm up again. Well, that's what's happened. We're on the 1,200-year cycle. We're on the warmest global warming cycle. Then the next global warming cycle, which will come in about 200 years, will not be as warm as this one, and one after that. So it just goes in cycles. But we're all getting colder and colder. But we're not going into an ice age. We're going to just go into a 70 to 120-year much colder period, more like the 1800s.
Okay, so with the data that you used to compile that data set, what exactly did you use to calculate that?
Well, what I used was cycles of the Earth, Moon, Sun alignment and gravitational cycles, and did the long-term average on the gravitational cycles. This is the cycles mainly where the strongest gravitational cycles that occur, and what we do is we get a weakening in the cycle, and every 230 years, then a stronger cycle every 230 years, or I should say it takes 230 years to go from strong cycle to weaker cycle. And so I plotted the gravitational cycles going all the way back to about 800 AD. And the long-term average lined up with the global warming cycles that come about every 220, 230 years. So that's kind of linked into this one graphic that I sent you on the pulse of warm water into the Arctic. So you can see that gravitational cycle strong. Well, that's an 18.5-year cycle from the left to right. It's 18.5 years. And you can see where the cycle on the left is stronger than the cycle on the right. Then you have three weaker ones in between. The funny thing about this is the cycle over the 450,000 years looks exactly like this. It just goes out in time, that's all. Sinusoidal curve goes out in time. This is why we had, or it even goes out 1,200 years in time. This is why, if you look at this, the cycle on the left, that was the same as the temperatures back 800 to 1,200 years ago, very warm. Then each global warming cycle coming forward got cooler. And then on the right, again, we're very warm again. So this cycle, the 18-year cycle, goes out to a 1,200-year cycle, and then you could take it all the way out to about a 500,000-year cycle. They all look about the same, the sinusoidal curve on the gravitational cycles. They all line up with the long-term global warming cycles every 120,000 years and the ones every 230 years. They just line up perfectly. And one reason we have these smaller cycles, if you go just a couple before that, one page before that, one chart before that, 9-year natural climate pulse. This is lines right up with the 9 years. The gravitational cycle, it takes 9 years from the moon to be strong in the northern hemisphere to get down to the southern hemisphere and back to the northern hemisphere. It takes 9 years. So you have a 9-year cycle. And if you look at the United States temperatures, there's a 9-year pulse on the temperature cycle in the United States,
see that.
which is very intriguing.
Yeah.
You see the 1990 pulse, 2000 pulse, and 2008 pulse. These are actual gravitational cycles where the moon was high in the northern hemisphere. As I said, it takes 9 years for it to get from the southern hemisphere, about 9 years. in the northern hemisphere, high in the sky in the northern hemisphere, then it goes to the southern hemisphere, back to the northern hemisphere. It takes 9 years. So this was back in 1990. It was high in the sky, 25 degrees. See, the moon changes different in its, as it revolves around, circles the Earth. It's an elliptical path, just like the Earth's elliptical path around the sun. And the elliptical path around the sun for the Earth takes about 120,000 years. That's what causes the ice ages and the warm periods. Now, on the moon changes its elevation in the sky for the peak elevation. Sometimes it'll only be as high as 18 degrees in the sky. That'll be the highest point during the year. But other times it'll get up to 28 degrees. So there's a wider margin there. Anyway, this was when it was high in the sky back in 1990. Then it was high in the sky again year 2000, and then in 2008. In 1990, a very warm surge of North Atlantic water split off from the Gulf Stream and went into the Arctic. That caused the very warm, the actual beginning stages of the global warming in the 1990s. Then in 1999, a much warmer pulse of warm water surged up into the Arctic.
Now,
it was the same spot on the cycle.
Was this warm up? Do you believe this to be caused by volcanic activity underneath?
No, this is caused by the plunging effect of the gravitational cycles.
So this is all strictly gravitational. Gotcha.
Gravitational cycles. It acts like a plunger. So that's why you have tides in the ocean twice a day. That's due to the full moon and new moon, because new moon is just about as powerful as the full moon. So you have a bulge on two sides of the Earth at the same time. And as the moon travels around the Earth, that's why it causes, when the moon goes on the backside of the Earth, you have the second high tide. So you have two high tides a year. This is plunging in the ocean, and the ocean bulges. And then when the gravitational pull relaxes, of course the bulge relaxes. So this is causing a plunging twice a day in the ocean. And then with the strong gravitational cycles, it causes a long-term type of plunge, like the one I'm showing every 9 years. When it's a very strong cycle in 1990, you had a strong cycle, then when it releases a little bit, you have a plunge into the Arctic. So some warm water plunged into the Arctic in 1990. That started the warm-up of the Arctic. The ice in the Arctic does not melt from the top down, it's from the bottom up, because it's all floating ice. There's no land. So most of it melts from the bottom up. And then in 1999, we had the warmest surge of water into the Arctic. It takes 13 years for the water to cool down once it gets into the Arctic. So that's why from 1999 up through 2010, 11 to 12 or so, it was much warmer because we had a big meltdown in the Arctic due to this very warm surge of water that was plunged into the Arctic. And then in 2008, we had, that was 8 years later, we had another plunge of warm water, not as warm, into the Arctic. And then probably we're having a plunge around 2017 or 16. I haven't seen any new information on it. There was probably another plunge, but not as cold. They get colder. They get less warm, let's say. That enables the Arctic to start cooling down. But that's what that was showing is this is what I believe causes global warming cycles. This big plunge comes about every 72 years, which means back in about the late 1920s, we had a plunge of warm air into the Arctic, and we had real warm 10-year period in the 1930s. And then it took it about 13 years to cool down, 10 to 13 years. Then from about 1941 on, it got cold again. At 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s were cold again until we got into this warm plunge again. So this is totally different than what you're hearing on the sun activity. But it kind of goes in hand. A lot of these cycles go hand in hand with the solar activity also.
That's what I feel like all the research, no matter what the topic is, when you're looking at natural cycles, it seems like they have their swings up and their swings down almost in harmony with one another. We've looked at sunspot data, tree ring data, ice core data, even some planetary alignments, lining up with certain natural cycles. What are your feelings with other factors like, I don't know if you've researched much about cosmic rays and their impact. Have you read any research by Jasper Kirby in the Cloud Project?
Yeah, there's, I actually have, on my website, I have a little part of it under the, let's see, if you can go to the website.
Yeah.
You can go to global weather.
Cycles.com, right? Globalweathercycles.com.
That will get you on there.
I was looking at your site and I see you have some free ebooks available that I would like our viewers to be aware of. So thank you for putting that on your site for people as a resource.
Free to read, and they can get a lot of good information from it. Okay, under earthquake, go down where it says earthquake dynamics.
Earthquake dynamics, gotcha.
Okay. That's has the sun on the left and the earth over on right. Mm-hmm. And this is a lot to do with the electromagnetic storms and where they stream towards the earth. One thing that happens here, and I have it explained up, what causes a sudden shift in the mantle in earthquakes. One thing and this is what I did through researching some papers, so this is directly from the papers. There's a moon's influence on the sun's well-established geomagnetic effect, as the moon's monthly elliptical path around the Earth crosses in back of the Earth during its full moon phase. The moon enters the Earth's geomagnetic field and interrupts the geomagnetic field. And you have to remember that the inner core of the Earth is electromagnetic. It's molten iron. So it's really magnetic. And then you have the sun with the geomagnetic waves. Everything is geomagnetic. And there's a great interaction between the two. And one reason it looks like the moon is causing some effects is because when it crosses between the Earth and the sun, it interrupts that electromagnetic field. It blocks it, interrupts it. And then when it passes out of it, and then it surges again. This is why it's all interrelated. It's a lot to absorb, and I don't really understand it all myself. But this is one reason why the moon has a greater effect than what people know. It has a much greater effect. Everyone's been looking at the sun, and they need to look at the moon.
It's very interesting. I mean, there is so much data out there, and they all seem to have this cyclical nature. And, it's fascinating to hear everyone's points of views because there is so much to it. I mean, we had a really interesting discussion with Valentina Zarkova and her work, and her models of the magnetic activity on the sun are showing that we could possibly plummet into a Maunder minimum situation within the next couple solar cycles.
Yeah. But there's so many.
Yes. It's we are gonna be doing that because we're gonna be cooling down just like we were. We have a major global cooling cycle coming for the next. The coldest part will be probably from about 2025 through 2065 to 2070, somewhere in there. But the next global warming cycle, we won't see weather like we do today for another 150 years or so.
And that's interesting, David, because a lot of scientists Zarkova was in agreement that in the 2030s we'd see somewhat of a stabilization again, but never return to the climate that we once knew. And you're saying 150. But either way, I think the consensus is that we are definitely heading into a cooling trend, and it could last for several decades. I think that's the overall outlook of what's happening right now.
Oh, yeah, it's going to be more than several decades. Now, a lot of people are saying through about 2050. Well, the coldest part, usually when you go into a global cooling cycle, the temperatures drop pretty fast over a 5 to 15-year period. Drop very fast. And usually about 15 to 25 years into the global cooling cycle, because this is so connected with the gravitational pulses, where the gravity of the Earth is lessened and it becomes stronger. It has great influence on the inner core, electromagnetic part of the inner core of the Earth. It's all iron. That the gravitational pull actually causes a bulge in the inner core of about 1.7 kilometers. And that causes great stress on the Earth's mantle. And during this great stress, we have an increase of volcanic activity.
Yeah, you show a chart where you predict between 2028 and 2035 we will have some type of large volcanic activity. Could you explain that further?
Yes, and that's due to the increased gravitational tug on the Earth as we enter the global cooling cycle. And what I looked at is we've had about 5 global warming cycles that have ended during the past 1,000 years. On 4 out of the 5 global cooling cycles that followed, about 15 to 20, 25 years into the global cooling cycle, you had a tremendous volcanic eruption, such as Tambora in 1815, down in the Philippines. And what happens is the combination of the global cooling cycle and the great volcano causes a year of no summer. It even plunges you further into global cooling. And 1816 was a year of no summer, and it even continued almost into 1817. And because of that, they ended up having great losses in Europe as far as growing vegetables, and there was famine, and there was blight, and this is all contributed to that period. And I believe something like 1/3 of Europe perished during the next 30 years or so. And this was the global cooling cycle. And some of it's also civil unrest. You have a lack of food, you're going to have civil unrest.
Yep.
And back there, at that time, we had 1 billion people on Earth. Now we're up around 5 billion? If we have an interruption in our food chain, can you imagine the civil unrest with 5 billion people on Earth?
That's what concerns myself, Jake, and all our viewers. I mean, when you look at history, we haven't really learned from our past, because I feel modern day society has taken what we have for granted, and this natural cycle that we're in, people just are, I mean, it's just alarming to me that, you know, we've taken for granted what we have and not sort of put that backbone of protection when it comes to people being more sustainable when it comes to food and all that. We just take for granted we could walk into a grocery store and have our loaf of bread. You know, most people nowadays have no clue how to even make a loaf of bread or or hunt or gather.
And that's what's going to happen if you have a break in your food chain. All of a sudden there's going to be a lack of food. And most people can only remember what happened during the last 10, 15 years. They can't really go beyond that period. And of course, the millennials now and all, they don't even know anything about World War II. They just don't know hard times. And it is coming. And when we go back to the gravitational cycles of the moon, and I keep stressing it, that people don't know enough about the effects of the moon. The moon has a more powerful effect on the Earth than variations of the sun, except for the long-term variation of the sun where we go into our ice ages. The moon, for example, on the cycles that I talk about, on 9-year cycles, 72-year cycles, 230-year cycles, we have changes in the gravitational pull of the moon that you can have periods where the gravitational pull is as much as 44 to 47% above the normal lunar tide. That's a huge change in the gravitational cycle, 44 to 47%. Then what I've found is when the gravitational cycle starts to relax, that's when you have your earthquakes. It's not during the strong gravitational pull, it's as the gravitational pull starts to lessen. And the reason for that is, remember I said the inner core of the Earth, the molten inner core can bulge by 1.7 kilometers, and that puts pressure on the outer core and crust of the Earth. Well, plates around the Earth actually ride on that. And if you've got a big bulge, and then all of a sudden it relaxes, that's why you get a slippage of plates in an earthquake.
Interesting.
Yeah. So
there is so much with the moon that between the pulses of warm water into the ocean, the warmest pulses come about every 72 years on a lunar cycle. So the moon, I'm saying, is a much bigger culprit to our global warming, global cooling cycles, our short-term ones, than the solar cycles.
Yeah.
Has a much bigger impact.
I mean, it seems to be all connected. There's many different theories flying around, and we have people in the community talking about the subject. A lot of people are driven to, point that we are going into an ice age, and they use the Milankovitch theory as their proof. Could you explain why that is not necessarily a reality in our lifetime?
Well, I know you can't say we're going into an ice age. An ice age lasts for about 70,000 years or so. And we just came out of the ice age about 7,000 to 10,000 years ago. And that was really the peak of our warm period was about 7,000 years ago when we had 50% less ice in the Arctic than we do today. But the ice age is still 30,000 years away. What we're looking at is the short-term global warming, global cooling cycles that come every 230 years. So we're going into a global cooling cycle that's intermingled in this instead. There are so many cycles.
There are.
So this is just a global cooling cycle within the big cycle. And then another 130, 40 years now, 50 years, we'll be going back into a global warming cycle again. We're not going to an ice age. We're just going into a very cool, fairly long-term period.
And that's similar to what Valentina Zarkova was saying with her research.
Pretty much.
On the sun.
She didn't expect she expected to see cooling, not a deep ice age. And everybody's got different theories. We got people who think that the glaciation is going to start here. Once the solar wind goes down to zero, we'll see the beginning of a low mode of the sun. There's all kinds of different theories out there. People study on the sunspots like Mari mentioned earlier. The biggest, measurement of stuff like that is the solar wind pressure has declined 30%. So I guess that's why a lot of these scientists think the sun is shutting down right now.
Well, it's shutting down in the upcoming the global cooling cycle we're entering now, but we don't have that much solar material records that go back in time. The gravitational cycles that I use, the Earth, Moon, Sun, we can research those cycles going back thousands of years. This is why I've researched it going back to 800 AD, and I plotted the cycles. It lines up exactly with the 230-year global warming, global cooling cycles.
Right.
So we could actually find out more from the lunar cycles than we can the solar cycles. And you cannot really predict the solar cycles out into the future, but you can predict the gravitational cycles out into the future.
That's fascinating.
So it's a much better field, and it's one that people are not recognizing. And we really need some federal grants to rep up here and start to see what's really happening here. But we're not talking about an ice age. I think one thing they're talking about is we had the mini ice age in the 1500s, 1600s, what they call the mini ice age, because it was very cold. I'm hoping what they're saying is we're going into a mini ice age, not into an ice age, because an ice age, they're really off base if they say we're going in an ice age. That's many thousands of years away.
I believe a lot of people are more going into like a Maunder state minimum, but turning into, I've heard people trying to put the puzzle together, combining, volcanic activity, cosmic rays, sunspot data, tree ring data, all, like everything. There are people out there worried that there's going to be some kind of glaciation, and I think that's where, in the community we work with, that's where the most fear is. These people envisioning a big iceberg take over, North America. And that's to me, I just observe the information coming in, and I like sort of laying it on the table and allowing people to discuss their thoughts, because it's really hard these days in the science community for people to do that, because there's so many, I talk a lot about people sort of grasping onto one answer and making it almost a religion, where they lose sight of everything else that might factor in to the truth. So having everyone working together, sharing their facts in a objective manner is so important. And I hope as people see these natural cycles come to play, that it is real. It's not like a man-made global warming epidemic. It's something natural, that we can actually broaden the discussion. And really what society needs is to learn how to adapt with this change, so there is not famine. We're in modern society. We should be able to come up with solutions where people aren't going to starve. We have to learn, and we have time to plan for that.
Well, that's true. And most of the people on Earth right now did not live through the 1950s and 60s during that very cold period. And that's what we're going to have, is actually the United States saw a taste of it this year, but even this year wasn't as cold as the 1950s and 60s. And it's going to be a shock to the people when we get this weather, because they're going to say, where did this come from? They're used to global warming. And when we get back to normalcy here, they're gonna think it's an ice age when it's not really an ice age. But we're gonna see the glaciers rebuilding for about 120 years. Ice will be extending out much more and thicker than it has been during the past 15 years, that's for sure. There is major changes coming, but it's not an ice age. But it is going to be drastically colder than what we've seen.
And with that comes the crop failures, the famine, and disease, which, if a bit of planning ahead and adapting, whether it be to growing indoors or just adapting a more sustainable, lifestyle. I mean, there's so many different solutions. I don't know. What are your thoughts, Jake?
It's interesting to hear everybody's take on what's going to happen. I'm just glad that you were willing to come on. You have experience with NOAA. You're a pretty big name, and you're not afraid to talk about global cooling. And I'm just thankful that we actually had a guest, like I said, it wasn't afraid to tell the truth, talk about cycles. You don't sound politically driven. You just give the facts straight out. And like Mari said, really, Mari pretty much took everything out of my head. We just have to learn how to adapt and not buy into the sensationalism of what some people are trying to hype this up to be, or maybe undersell it. So really, it's just a preference and a perception, really.
Well, that's true. We don't want to oversell it, but one thing we have to watch out for is, are we going to have one of these VMI 5 to 6 volcanoes probably a 6. Very strong volcano. VMI 6 is like saying a Category 5 hurricane. Are we going to have that sometime between, say, 2025 to 2035 to 2040? It could be anywhere in there. It could even come as early as 2023. But sometime in that period, we are going to have a huge volcano in connection with the global cooling cycle. And there's a high probability that the Earth will see a year of no summer in the northern latitudes.
Yeah.
And we have to learn from what happened from China up through Europe during that period, and even here in the United States. In 1816, in July, there was ice on small ponds in Pennsylvania, killing frost all the way from New England to Virginia every month of the summer. And this could very well happen again, not too distant future from now. And we're going to have to be prepared for it, because if it does happen, and there's a high probability, there will be a shortage of food.
And you're echoing a lot of what John Casey has said as well. He's predicted a major volcano eruption between now and the 2030s. And so, again, it's on a cycle. The last big one we had was in 1850. So technically, by you saying 2023 is probably right about the area where we might see a first big one, or maybe just a little earlier. So,
well, we're going to see an increase in earthquake activity in the early 2020s, and the volcano is a little bit harder to predict. John Casey told me they're monitoring 3 big volcanoes that have the potential of being a major volcanic activity. Now, no one knows exactly when they'll go, but John and I, we've done presentations together, and we're on the same page pretty much on the timetable on things occurring. It's just he's a little bit more, well, he uses the solar activity, and I'm using predominantly the interactions of the Earth, Moon, Sun.
But it's amazing how your cycles and other people's cycles still correlate the same thing, and that's
right.
That's the interesting part about your research and others.
That's right. We're all coming up with pretty much the same type of information as far as what will be happening.
And I just think it's fantastic that you have spent this time with us to answer our questions. I know it's such a broad topic. There's so much to discuss, but we could probably wrap it up now. I just want to thank you again, David, for taking your time with us and explaining your thoughts and opinions on the earth changes that are happening on our planet. And hopefully more people will listen and sort of open their eyes and try to see the big picture, to not be so surprised in the near future when food is starting to sort of trickle off. They're more prepared.
Right, and they will be surprised when it happens. And actually, global cooling started about the year 2014 or so.
Yeah, I believe
it's
that.
already started, because the northern portions of the United States had real bad winters in 2014, 2013, then 2015 we had the El Nino that warmed everything up.
Yeah.
Or 2016 we did, excuse me.
I remember the 2014 winter was very brutally cold. We had 2 different deep polar vortexes. I was living in southwest Ohio, and we were looking at highs in the mid below zero. 17 below zero was some of the highs for the days. And then when we got the second shot of polar vortex, it wasn't as cold, but we're talking daytime highs and -6, -4 for 3 or 4 consecutive days. And even after that, we're looking at 13, 10 degrees for highs for several days after that. So that's interesting that you brought up 2014, because I also believe that's when the cooling started too. That was a very strange snap of cold air that I've ever experienced. I'm only 40, but like you said,
right.
People who didn't grow up in the 50s and 60s, this is going to be a shock.
Well, the ice in the Arctic was starting to regenerate greatly in 2014, 2013. And then then the big El Nino came on in 2015, and that interrupted everything. Then it started to restore a little bit, and the La Nina, kind of a strange pattern this year, is hurt it a little bit. But as the La Nina goes away, we're going to be back into that major ice restoration we had in 2013, 2014. And really, 4 out of the last 5 winters up in the northern tier states have been a little bit more normal, more like the 1960s.
Yeah.
It's been much colder and snowier. So it really did begin back in 2014. It just takes time to cool down the oceans and get things more uniform around the Earth so everyone realizes the cooling. It's just going to take a few more years to get everything in place to where it really gets cold. But this winter, that was a pretty good shot of cold air.
It's a good start.
Makes people think a little bit more about what it was in the 1960s. But like you were saying, it was minus this and that up there. And we have a summer cottage in Maine, and I believe it got down probably minus 25 where we were up there. But when I grew up in Vermont, northern Vermont, in the 50s and 60s, it was pretty common that you would go from about Christmas into March without getting temperatures up to freezing.
Wow.
It'd be 32 degrees or below during the whole period. Now, they didn't see that this year. We've had a mix of some warmer shots of air up there mixed in with cold, and there's more cold air coming. Looking at models for the next couple of weeks.
Oh yeah.
If you're living up there, it's going to be some cold shots coming in. So we're getting normal here. Even over in Europe, London, Great Britain is going to see their coldest air of the winter coming in during the next couple of weeks. So it's starting to spread. It's starting to spread, and just wait for the next couple of years. It's going to be cold.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. Indeed. So thanks again. Our viewers are followers of you, so I'm sure, they're going to be very excited to hear this conversation.
It was a pleasure talking to you.
On our channel. So I would just like to thank you again for doing what you're doing, staying true, and spreading that awareness so people can prepare and adapt.
Yep.
And I thank you for spreading the word.
Future.
That's certainly true, and we're already going in through the changes into the next global cooling cycle. It just takes a little time to get into it, because we have never been in a cycle before where we've lived through a global warming cycle into a global cooling cycle. So we're just we don't have that much data, so we don't know how many years it takes, 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 years, but evidence is there that the climate is now changing towards the cooling.
You watched the State of the Union with President Trump the other night?
Part of it I did, yes.
There's a lot of, he's taken a lot of criticism because he actually mentioned all the storms, but he didn't blame man-made global warming. And I found it kind of, for me, I've always been a Weather Channel kind of guy just because some of their meteorologists I've always liked, but I found it a little odd that the Weather Channel did an article so quickly criticizing the president for not blaming man-made global warming, as if to pass this off.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, okay, I need to send you a graphic. I'm going to be doing a hurricane webinar on Tuesday, and I have a great graphic on there that I created on hurricanes, United States hurricane landfalls during the past 120 years. Landfalls and major hurricane landfalls.
Yeah, and to finish up on that point, it's what's going to be hard for me from now on is how to trust the integrity of that particular channel now, since they are clearly trying to push man-made global warming on everyone.
Oh, they are. The Weather Channel is very liberal on that.
Let's open it up here. Strongest cycle in 40 to... Oh, I got to plug my laptop in.
Correct.
Okay.
And what this shows is going back to about 1860. The blue line on top is tracking the hurricane landfalls for the United States for meteorologists and climatologists, and it's like the AMA for doctors. And I wanted my corporation to be a member, and they rejected it because they went on my website and looked at my views on climate change, and they rejected they would not let my company become a member of the AMS. And I talked to someone there, and I was only second or third time in the past 50 years that a company has been rejected. You better believe that's political.
Yeah, beyond political.
They are hook, line, and sinker on man-made global warming, just like the Weather Channel. All politically driven.
Have you been attacked in other ways when it comes to censorship, or just
I've
sort
been
of blacklisted?
I had the University of Maine shut down one of my talks. A conservative got shut down at Berkeley. Now some famous meteorologists, climatologists, such as Dr. William Gray, who passed away a year or so ago from the University of Colorado, he and another famous meteorologist got shut down right at their own university. They wanted to talk on climate change, and the university shut them down. This is common. We're not allowed to speak at universities.
And it looks like to me Berkeley is not helping themselves, because they get labeled as being a liberal college, and when you see a conservative get shut down because he speaks about something that's not on a liberal agenda, that to me right there, Berkeley is digging their own hole. If they don't want that label, things like that shouldn't happen.
No, it shouldn't. And when I got shut down up in Maine, I was going to speak at a can't remember the name of the place now. It's an institute up there, but they're closely connected with the university. And when we set up when I accepted to speak there, I told them, well, I want you to
Thank you for taking some time out of your day to talk to us about the climate change and just the crazy jungle out there involving earth changes, basically. Really appreciate your time today.
It is a jungle out there, that's for sure.
Absolutely.
Don't want to learn or anything. It's terrible.
It is terrible. We on our channel, I try very hard to have a non-biased approach, and it's just alarming to me, when I'm the habitual fence sitter watching people bicker and argue about facts that are so blatantly obvious about just natural cycles. It's shocking to me.
Well, it is, because mainly when you talk to them, they only want to go back 50 to 100 years.
Right.
That's all they want to talk about.
It's crazy. And there's so many pieces to the puzzle for the big picture, and we wanted to take a non-biased approach and just show people the science and the facts so they can make their own conclusions, to what's going on. To me, it's hard for me not to be biased now, because I just feel like the data is it's staring you right in the face. You can't deny it once you look at things objectively. So on Grand Solar Minimum channel, we bring in different people. We've had John Casey on, we've had Valentina Zarkova, we've had other independent researchers on, so to have you on for your input is great. All the data it may be different, but it lines up to the same sort of time frame where society really is going to have to learn to adapt. To
realize I'm going to be speaking on natural cycles. And they said that's okay. So they had it all set up, and they advertised it for a month. Then 3 days before my talk, I noticed that 3 people from the University of Maine were on my website. The next morning, I got a letter canceling my talk.
Wow.
And they blamed it on staffing problems at the Institute. Well, I went on their website, and their website was trying to reschedule another talk for that same time period.
Unreal.
And then the news media got a hold of the Institute, and the president actually admitted that they were strong-armed by the University of Maine.
Strong-armed by who?
The University of Maine has a climate division. They get a lot of grant money.
So it's the grant money that they're worried about.
The grant money. They want to shut down anything that talks about natural cycles because they want to preserve their grant. They want to keep going as is. They don't want any interference at all.
And David, I think you just answered my next question, which was, why do you think the real real reason is why so many deny global cooling, and it's starting to sound like money has a lot of the reason to do with it.
Well, it's all money. It's driven through the grant system, for one thing, because the grant system is driven through big power money that's pushing green energy. That's the big source of it.
Yeah.
So that trickles down to the grant system. And the grant system, when they start putting out grants, it usually stays that way for 10, 15 years when they try to attack a problem. So the only grant money available for about a 15-year period was for man-made, to try to prove man-made global warming. You could not get a grant. I have talked to a couple of retired heads of science departments at universities, and they said you could not get a grant to study natural cycles. And if they knew you were trying to study natural cycles or spoke up against man-made global warming, you would either lose grants or not be able. And the red line on the bottom is the major hurricanes. So what you see is between 1871 to about 1901, let's say 1880 or so, we had a big uptick in hurricane landfalls. Then about 70 years later, another big uptick. And now here we are 70 years later, and we're given another big uptick.
Oh, wow.
So this is natural cycles.
Right.
So what the Weather Channel, they don't do their own research. So they don't really have a clue what's going on. The National Hurricane Center doesn't have a clue what's going on either, because they don't really research cycles enough, especially natural cycles. So this is why I'm number one on the, I've been number one on the preseason hurricane predictions the past 10 years. Number one in the country.
You had a busy year last year then.
I nailed it. I predicted the hurricane for Florida, the Gulf, and Texas. I nailed it.
Nice. Well, not nice. I mean, those were bad
But this is all natural cycles. Tracking hurricanes through natural cycles.
Right. You knew what you were looking at.
I know what I'm looking at, and these other people that are putting out the garbage, they don't know what to look at.
Is it?
That's the problem.
I think a lot of it's just politically, motivated at this point. Like a lot of people, it's hard to find the integrity in the research, without the controversy these days.
Well, I think the Weather Channel has even fired a couple of meteorologists that were questioning man-made global warming.
Wow.
Wow.
And
Right.
there's a lot of things out there. I'm a member of the American Meteorological Society, which is the big group